Okay, well, while Jim's responding, let's go ahead and get started. So this is, I guess, welcome everyone on the Facebook live stream and the Zoom to our first virtual seminar for the AFRE Fall Seminar Series. There's probably going to be some kinks, so we will figure out how to work all those out, but here's what we're thinking right now. So we can see, Matt and I can see, and Jim, I guess, all of the participants on the Zoom link. If you would like to ask a question during the seminar, if you could choose the raise your hand button, we will unmute you, and then you can say mean things to Eva, and then we will mute you again. After the seminar is over, Jim, correct me if I'm wrong about this, I believe you're going to unmute everyone on the Zoom call, and then we will do the same thing with the raise your hand function, and then we will call on people to ask their questions, and after doing that, Eva the chance to respond. Is that correct, Jim?
That is correct.
Okay. I should mention we also have the the Q&A feature. So if you have a short question rather than a long academic, takes 7 paragraphs to get your question out question, you can type that short kind of clarifying question in the Q&A box, and we will be able to see that and let Eva respond to that. So with those rules in mind, I guess I would like to introduce our speaker, Eva-Marie Meemken, who has been all over the world. So she got her PhD from University of Göttingen in Germany. After that, she's done postdocs at University of Minnesota. Was that with Mark Belmar?
Yes.
With Mark, and then at Cornell, was that with Chris Barrett?
Yes, and Miguel Gomez.
Just with all the huge names, and she started in March after the world crumbled. She started a new position as assistant professor at University of Copenhagen. So welcome, Eva, and I guess without further clarifications, we'll let you get on with it.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for the invitation. It has been a very interesting afternoon, evening so far, interacting with everyone. So since all conferences or many conferences have been cancelled, that was a perfect opportunity to meet new people. I'm very, very happy to be here. Thank you also for the kind introduction, and thank you everyone for attending this seminar. I'm also happy to be the first speaker this fall. So in this paper, I look at sustainability, certification, fair trade, organic and global gap among small and large farms in Peru using secondary data. And in a nutshell, in this paper, I look at participation rates and predictors of participation. And to me, this has been one of some of the most interesting results, because I feel I can really contribute some new insights that previous studies, which have largely been based on small case studies, were not able to show. But I also look at farm incomes and the adoption of farm practices, especially integrated pest management, which is believed to promote an environmental conservation. So sustainability standards are a very controversially discussed topic, not only in the scientific literature, but also in the general public. And I think this is partly attributable to the fact that previous results are very mixed, which in turn I think is attributable to the fact that the internal and external validity of much of the previous literature has been relatively limited. Also, this literature has a huge focus on small farms. So in this paper, I address some of these gaps. So I use nationally representative data, and I believe this is one of the first studies to do this, and pseudo-panel methods and data. Again, also kind of a novelty, because most of the previous studies are based on cross-sectional data. Also, this data set includes not only small farms, but also large farms. So I'm able to contribute new insights on this group, which has been largely overlooked in this literature. I find that certification is associated with a change in farming practices among large farms, but not small farms. And the same holds also for income, although here the evidence is perhaps not as conclusive. So why should we care at all about a sustainability certification? As you are all very well aware, the agri-food sector contributes importantly to some of the world's most pressing environmental challenges, such as climate change, deforestation, or desertification. And at the same time, there are also many social issues that should concern us, such as child and forced labor, poverty, and food insecurity, as the agricultural sector employs some of the world's most vulnerable people. So one problem is that many of the environmental and social issues are poorly regulated or just very difficult to enforce along value chains that are increasingly global. At the same time, promoting responsible consumption and production is on the international development agenda, as is also reflected in the 12th Sustainable Development Goal. So the question is whether sustainability standards can help enforcing higher social and environmental standards in this context. That is at least the promise of many sustainability standards. So the goal is to improve the living conditions of especially small farms and especially lower income countries, while at the same time also improving environmental conditions. So that farmers agree to comply with a set of, for example, on farming practices, and then they are incentivized or compensated to do so. And the most obvious incentive is the price premium, so a higher price for certified products. But there are also many indirect benefits which are often overlooked, such as access to markets, services, and credits. So in that regard, standards really link rich consumers, those who are willing and able to pay higher prices for certified products, and poor producers, those who are willing to comply with these standards. But I also want to point out that this development, the proliferation of sustainability standards, is not only a demand-driven development, because there has been a lot of support from diverse actors, and there's also an ongoing process of commercialization and mainstreaming. So for example, many development agencies promote and finance farmer adoption of sustainability standards in lower income countries, and many governments also promote consumption of certified products in higher income countries. And then private companies have been involved in this process. Nowadays, you can buy certified products in many large supermarkets, Starbucks, McDonald's, you name it. So by these large companies adopting certified products, that has definitely increased access to those products, further increasing demand. So today, sustainability certification is important mainly for a couple of tropical export products, such as coffee and cocoa. So for coffee and cocoa, about 30% of the total global production area is certified. And I put a range here because it is a bit difficult to know what the exact number is because of double certification. So farmers might be fair trade certified and organic certified and Rainforest Alliance certified. So there's a risk of double counting farmers and area, and that's why it's difficult to know the exact number. So there are hundreds of sustainability standards, but I want to introduce 3 standards which are very popular, very important in terms of the number of farmers who participate, and also in terms of the area certified. And I'm also introducing them because those happen to be exactly the ones that are very important in Peru. So the first is fair trade. Fair trade used to be one organization, and then it's split into 2 organizations, Fair Trade International and Fair Trade USA, over controversies around the question whether large farms or plantations should be able to join certification programs. Today, both organizations certify both large and small farms. The key features of fair trade are the fair trade floor price and the fair trade social premium. So the fair trade floor price is the price that fair trade sets that is believed to allow for a decent living of farmers and workers. And the floor price is given to farmer organizations, not to individual farmers, or groups of workers and can be invested in various ways, for example, quality upgrading, social projects, whatever people feel is important. And fair trade also includes environmental standards, which is not widely known. Then there are various organic standards. Probably the most well-known ones are USDA organic and EU's organic standard. But most of the organic standards are very similar because they're all based on EFORM's standards. EFORM is the umbrella organization for organic agriculture. So the main idea of organic farming and certification is that chemical inputs are not used, but instead farmers should use agroecological practices to conserve natural resources and nutrient cycles, thereby reducing pests and increasing soil fertility. Most organic standards do not have mandatory rules on social issues. Then Global Gap is a retailer initiative. That's why you typically don't see this label on products that you buy in the supermarket. Global Gap focuses on food safety and quality, which refers to pre and post-harvest activities. And most of the Global Gap products are fruits and vegetables. So an important question is whether standards really deliver on their promise to improve the livelihoods of farmers, while at the same time also promoting environmental sustainability. And of course, I'm not the first person to look into this. So there's a huge body of literature that looks at precisely this question. And here I want to summarize some of the available evidence to illustrate that results are very mixed. So I'm quoting here from original studies. So some studies find that certification fails to increase producer income, or that it hardly affects welfare or even reduces incomes, and that certified producers are more often found below the absolute poverty line. On the other hand, other studies find that certification increases living standards, that it has a positive impact on incomes and improves overall livelihoods. So very diverse findings, which also holds for studies that look at environmental effects. So some studies suggest that certification is associated with changes in farming practices. Others suggest that this may not hold for all indicators that we might be interested in. And other studies suggest that if there's any effect, that effect might be rather small. So again, pretty mixed results. So you might ask whether there are any generalizable statements that we can make based on this huge body of literature. And I think one is that effects are pretty context specific. So effects can even vary within the same country. There have been attempts to calculate average effects, a couple of meta-analyses, and these suggest that effects are typically positive, although relatively modest. And the important point is that we probably even overestimate these effects because of self-selection. Selection bias is a problem in this context because it might be the case that better off farmers, or those farmers that already comply with standards, might self-select into certification. And certification in the smallholder context is typically group-based, so it's cooperatives managing certification. So it might be the case that the best managed cooperatives self-select into certification. And it might also be the case that the most privileged areas self-select into certification. So this is a very difficult problem to deal with, especially given that most of the available studies use observational cross-sectional data. And as you all know, identification can be very challenging based on that type of data. Another problem is limited external validity, which is related to non-random samples of especially farmer organizations. So I'm giving an example here from my work, and this is to say I'm not criticizing everyone else, I'm criticizing everyone else, including myself. And I also want to emphasize that the reason why people collect primary data from small case studies is that secondary data is often not available. So most of the large surveys, for example, LSMS data, don't cover questions on certifications. So it's typically not possible to use secondary data. So you have to rely on primary data. So in this study, we sampled 3 farmer cooperatives in Uganda. And even if you have a perfect identification strategy, the results may not hold for other regions or other crops, even in the same country. So many people have been arguing that we need better sampling strategies, or ideally we want to have nationally representative secondary data, which again is typically not available. I also want to highlight some exceptions. So there are some studies that do better in this regard. So again, an example from my own work, we did this study in Ivory Coast where we made great effort into coming up with a complete list of all farmer organizations in the country that focus on cocoa production. So here we cover a large area of the entire cocoa production area in the country. And based on the complete list of all farmer cooperatives, we randomly sampled cooperatives. So, and other studies have been doing similar things, but these studies also focus on specific regions, crops, or standards. Another gap in this literature is the smallholder bias. So most of the studies focus on smallholder farmer participation in certification schemes. And I think that is attributable to the fact that standard setting organizations such as Fairtrade emphasize smallholders, even though they also certify large farms. And of course, also development programs often tend to focus on poor farmers, which of course makes sense for a lot of reasons. And I think this bias is also reflected in the scientific literature. Are there any questions so far? That does not seem to be the case. So then why does it make sense to focus on large farms at all? Well, a large share of the global land is farmed by large farms, even if their number might be small. And that development, or that tendency can be observed in many also lower income countries and will likely be also hold in the future because of sectorial change and industrialization. So many farmers moving out of farmers, finding better paid job in other sectors. So since a large share of the farm is farmed by large farms, their behavior matters disproportionately for regional environmental outcomes. Also, large farms can contribute importantly to rural employment generation, especially for women, as several of the studies by our colleagues in Leuven have pointed out. So as you're probably all aware, there's huge controversy around the question whether small farms or large farms are more environmentally sustainable or their working conditions are better. I think at least for working conditions, we can say that they are not necessarily better on small farms. In terms of certification, what do we know about large farms? Well, other studies have been suggesting that farm size might determine adoption decisions and outcomes, but the evidence is relatively limited because those studies also use data from small farms, then maybe differentiating between smaller small farms and larger small farms. But in theory, we could assume that larger farms are better able to make investments that would actually lead to an environmental and social change. We also know that monitoring, especially of working conditions, is easier in the large farm context because in the small farm context, like think of a farmer cooperative with hundreds of thousands of members, it's very difficult to monitor the behavior of a large number of spatially dispersed farms. That is much easier when you work with large farms. So the available literature on large farms and certification has focused largely on working conditions and not so much on economic outcomes and environmental performance, at least in the context of lower income countries. So the contribution of this paper is to use nationally representative data, which is a repeated cross-section that I use as a pseudo panel. And this data set also includes large producers. So just some brief context on Peru, which I think is useful to understand the results. So Peru is a very diverse country in terms of the climate, the topography, and also human development and infrastructure. So you can divide the country into 3 different zones, which is the coastal area, which is the orange part here in this map. That is a desert area. There's almost no rain. But paradoxically, there has been the emergence of a fruit and vegetable sector in this area. So the picture that you can see here in the middle is green asparagus. So those are huge farms that produce green asparagus for the export market. So much of the green asparagus consumed in the US is actually from Peru. Then there's the Andean region, which because of its topography is characterized by smallholder farming, and then the Amazonas region. And as a result of this diverse agroecological conditions, there are various crops that are produced in Peru, such as corn, rice, quinoa, potatoes, coffee, asparagus, and so on. So certification in Peru is relatively popular, but especially for a small number of crops, such as coffee, bananas, cocoa, and fresh fruits and vegetables. And as I've mentioned before, the main standards are organic, global gap, and fair trade. For this study, I use data from the National Agricultural Survey, which is provided by the Peruvian government. So it's publicly available. You can just go to the home page and download the data. If you speak some Spanish, you can just go ahead and work with it. So this is a great data set. It's a repeated cross-section covering several years, although I should point out that some of the variables are not available for the year 2014 for a reason that I cannot tell you. So this is a repeated cross-section that includes a panel, and each year 26,000 producers were drawn anew as to be nationally representative, and the data are also representative at the highest administrative level, which is departments. So the sampling strategy is based on the agricultural census and the enumeration areas that were identified in that census. So pretty much a standard way of collecting large surveys. A bit on the structure of the panel. So overall, we have a huge number of observations, but the panel data set included in this repeated cross section is relatively small. So I classify, or I refer to as panel whenever there's more than one observation for any given farm. So about 7,000 farms we observe more than once in this data set, which is illustrated in this table. So you can see that most of the farms are only observed once, and then some of the farms are observed more than once. But it's really the smallest share of the entire sample. So then a very great feature about this survey is that it includes not only small farms, but also large farms. And I really want to highlight that because most of the available data sets don't include large agro-industrial farms. So small farms in this survey are defined as family-based farms that farm less than 50 hectares. But in reality, these farms are typically much smaller, on average 7 hectares. Then large farms are defined as agro-industrial companies that farm more than 50 hectares. But again, the average is much larger with 600 hectares. And this is just a smaller set of the entire sample. So as this data set is nationally representative, it includes all types of different farms. And I exclude all of the farms that only produce livestock. This is because certification in Peru is currently not relevant for livestock production. So I'm excluding those farms. So then some of the farms in the data set are certified, and the shortcoming is that we don't know which crop is certified. Based on the information that I provided earlier, we can make informed guesses. So for example, if a farm produces coffee and potatoes, we can be relatively sure that the certified crop is coffee and not potatoes. And also I should point out that in this study, I focus on farms and not at plot level. So it's not a huge problem that we don't know which specific crop is certified. In fact, I think this is actually an advantage. So we can look at average farm outcomes irrespective of the crop that is produced, which again increases external validity. So in the data set, we can differentiate between 3 different standards. And then there's another category, which is others. Unfortunately, it's not specified, but I think we can be relatively sure that this should be Rainforest Alliance and UTZ certification. Yes, farms can be double certified, but it's not very common. So double certification would mean that a farm is certified under fair trade and organic standards, or any other of the combinations. The certification of farms can vary over time. So farmers that haven't been certified previously can enter into certification, or they can also be excluded for the program. Unfortunately, we don't know the reasons why that happens for particular farms. So you have seen this table already. This is just telling you how many farms were observed once or more than once. And then I added another column showing you how many certified farms were observed once or more than once. And from that table, it becomes very clear that there are very few farms, certified farms, that are observed more than once. And if you look at just those farms observed more than once, and you look at whether the certification status for those farms has changed, that holds for about 140 farms. So that's a very small sample size. That's why I'm suggesting we shouldn't overly rely on just those small farms, small number of farms that are observed more than once and that have a change in the certification status. In terms of outcome variables, the first set of variables relate to economic outcomes, farm income especially, which is calculated pretty much in a standard way. So I take the value of crop and livestock production, which includes the value of the product sold and also the value of the products not sold. And then I subtract production costs, and production costs, that's pretty comprehensive in the data set because it's an agricultural survey. So that is covering many things that you could think of. And as the data were collected in different years, I account for inflation. I want to point out some shortcomings. So the value of own land and family labor is not captured in this survey, but it's a general problem. Many other data sets also don't include those figures. Then, well, because of that, I suggest we should understand this variable as a proxy for farm income and economic outcomes. Well, and economic variables are also not available for 2014, so the data set becomes a bit shorter. Then I also look at farm practices and especially integrated pest management, which is a dummy variable that is coded as 1 if farms use integrated pest management. And again, ideally, we would want to have all types of data on actual environmental outcomes, but those data are not available in the data set. So I suggest we should understand this variable and also the other ones as a proxy for environmentally friendly farming and economically viable farming. So integrated pest management suggests a combination of different methods such as ecological, chemical, or mechanical practices to reduce pests and plant production. So no method is ruled out, but the goal is to reduce chemical inputs to a minimum. So you can group these techniques into different groups. Those are the categories that are used in the survey. Well, the overall goal of integrated pest management is, of course, to enhance yields and profits, while at the same time reducing the negative environmental effect of intense input use. I also argue, and others do as well, that integrated pest management is relevant in both low and high income countries, because even in some lower income countries, chemical inputs are widely available and they are sometimes overused or not used according to the recommendations, so it can have a very negative environmental impact. I'd also argue that this is relevant irrespective of the actual chemical input use, because when farmers learn new techniques to reduce pests today, maybe tomorrow they don't have to overly rely on chemical input use. You might also ask whether whether farmers would actually understand what integrated pest management is, because it's a complex term. I would argue that it is well captured and explained in the survey. So this is an agricultural survey specifically designed to capture agricultural issues using trained enumerators. And I looked in the manual for enumerators, which is pretty comprehensive. Also, the question on integrated pest management is followed up by several more detailed questions on the particular practices. So asking farmers whether they use any of those practices that you can see here in this list. So I think even if farmers have never heard the term integrated pest management, we can be reasonably sure that they were provided with sufficient information to be able to answer the question. There are also other farm practices that might be interesting, but these are unfortunately only captured in the survey for small farms. So these are organic fertilizers, chemical fertilizers, pesticides, crop rotation, and terraces. I will not focus so much on these in the presentation. So then the first way to think about this problem could be modeled as follows. So we have the outcome of producer I in year T. So the outcome would be whether the farmer or the farm uses integrated pest management or the log of farm income. And the main variable of interest here is whether that producer is certified in any given year. And we include producer fixed effects, thereby accounting for time invariant unobserved heterogeneity, which is of course the main reason why we appreciate fixed effects models and why it's great to have panel data, because for these time invariant unobserved heterogeneity, we can't really control and cross-sectional data unless we have a perfect instrument. Oh yeah, this is just to remind me to say that we also that I also differentiate between the different type of standards. So then the main variables of income of interest would become whether the farm is fair trade, organic, global gap certified. So why would you use pseudo panels at all? Well, I hope I made that point already, but just to make very clear, I bring this point across. Ideally, you would want to have a perfectly balanced panel data set, and then you have some farms that are certified, and ideally the certification status varies for some farms. And in that case, you can just go ahead with fixed effects models and you're good. And that might also work if your data set looks like this, but my data set really looks more like this. So we don't want to rely overly on the small number of farms that are observed more than once and that have a change in the certification status. That's why I'm using pseudo panel methods, which are very well suited for repeated cross-section, so the type of data that I'm dealing with. And the idea here is to build synthetic groups, so cohorts of individuals that can be followed over time. And in my case, I use group averages, which are clusters, districts, provinces, and departments. So here you can see that the sample size reduces with each level. So for provinces and departments, the sample sizes are actually quite small. So maybe we don't want to overly rely on those results either. So this is the same table just for large farms, just that the sample sizes are a bit smaller because, well, there are in general not so many large farms. There are any questions until now?
Okay. I had a quick question.
Yes. Yes.
Have there been trends in consolidation kind of over your panel period? So have kind of some smaller farms been bought out by larger farms, and how does that affect your construction of these?
Ooh, that is a very good question. I have to think about that. I'm not sure we can answer that question based on the data. But you can certainly look at the development of farm sizes over time. Yeah, I have to look at that. I don't know the numbers.
Oh, yeah, no worries. I'm just curious.
Then the main variable of interest can be defined in two different ways. One is to generate a dummy variable, which is coded as 1 if at least one farm in any given cluster, province, district, and so on is certified, or as the proportion of certified farms. So there are two different ways of thinking about this variable in the context of the pseudo panel. But then the model would look very much the same as the one that I just showed you. So just that we look at the mean of farm income, or the proportion of farms that use integrated pest management in any given area. And then the main variable of interest would be the proportion of certified farms, or whether at least one farm is certified in that area. And we can include the geographical fixed effects, so that is cluster fixed effects or department or district fixed effects, thereby again controlling for unobserved time invariant heterogeneity. So this is a pretty much commonly used method, so nothing super new. And there are also some challenges or limitations that I also want to point out. So of course, as for regular fixed effects models, we have a problem if they are time variant unobserved factors, so that might still lead to biased results. We have a problem if there's systematic error, so if all certified farms answer questions in a different way than non-certified farms, and reverse causality. So we should keep these things in mind when thinking about causality of the results. Although I also want to point out that, again, in terms of identification, this study does much better than many of the previous studies, given that they were based on cross-sectional data. So we move to the results, and this is actually one of my most favorite findings. So here you see the sample sizes again for small farms and large farms. And then I calculated the share of farms that are certified in each year. And the interesting point here is that only about 1% of the small farms are certified, which is relatively small number. But then if you look at large farms, participation rates are actually much larger, ranging from 18 to over 30%. So in relative terms, certification is much more relevant for large farms than for small farms, which is so interesting given this bias in the literature and in the debate on small farms. So I think we are overlooking an important group here. Here you can see the different certification schemes. So the main point here is that small farms are more likely to be certified organic, and large farms more likely to be certified global gap. So it differs what type of certification scheme they would join. And in this table, you can also see that the sample sizes for all but small organic certified and large global gap certified farms can be relatively small. So maybe we don't want to overestimate the results when we differentiate by standard in the regression. I don't want to go into detail here. The point I want to make is just that double certification, so farmers adopting fair trade and organic or any other combination, is not as common as you might think. So most farms are actually just certified under one standard. Who participates? Well, the key point here is that certified farms are very different from average farms in almost in almost any way that you can imagine, including crops. So here, this is a table where I ordered crops by their importance. So for example, non-certified, for example, 41% and 29% of the non-certified farms produce maize and potatoes. And then when you look at certified farms on the right-hand side, you see that bananas, coffee, and citrus, so some of the more commercial crops that are often for the export market, are much more produced, or much more farmers produce these crops. So a very important differentiation here. The same also holds for large farms. So this is the same table just for large farms. So certified large farms are likely to produce grapes, avocados, citrus, or asparagus, whereas more non-certified farms produce some of the more food food production oriented crops.
Eva, we've got a
Yes.
quick question here from My
Yes.
Wish. My Wish is asking, is there any eligibility requirement in terms of land size to be certified?
Yeah, no, there are no official requirements, but it's so farmers that are really small are unlikely to join certification alone. So they would have to be a member of a cooperative, because individual certification is typically very expensive. So for an individual small farmer, that might be just infeasible, too costly to join certification. But when they are organized in a cooperative, there's no requirement in terms of the minimum area.
Perfect, thanks so much.
Then certified and non-certified large and small farms also differ in almost in many other ways. These are descriptive statistics. I don't want to go into detail. I just want to say that certified and non-certified farms differ significantly and substantially in almost every characteristic that you might want to look at. Maybe a bit more interesting, the most important correlates are the following. So as I just said, smallholder certification is typically group-based. So being a member of a producer organization is a very strong predictor of participation. It's almost impossible for individual small farms to be certified. Then access to extension is a very important predictor. Of course, here we don't know whether farmers have to have access to extension to be able to enter into certification, or whether better access to extension is the outcome of certification. The direction is, of course, not clear here. And then the proportion of certified neighbors also matters a lot. So the more certified neighbors you have, the more likely you are to be certified yourself, and that holds at all the different levels that we can look at. And this is actually in line with previous findings that have used data from just a small number of villages or cooperatives. And these studies have been suggesting that collective action, network effects, and external support are the most important predictors of certification. So it's kind of nice that using this nationally representative data set, we can show that in a maybe a more convincing way. So in this picture, focusing on the right-hand side first, you can see the proportion of large farms that are certified. So the darkish green areas would tell you that about 50% of all large farms are certified in those departments. So for large farms, we can see a clustering of certified farms in the coastal area. Again, that is a desert zone there where the horticultural sector has been emerging with, for example, green asparagus for export production. So that is what you see here in this picture. For small farms, it's a bit, there's not so much a clear picture, although in the north there seem to be higher prevalence of certification. Who benefits? Well, here are some descriptive statistics on economic outcomes just to show you some of the magnitudes. So looking, and here again, the results are pretty similar for both small and large farms. Certified farms, irrespective of their size, have a higher value of farm production. They also have higher costs, also especially labor costs. But although they also spend more, they still have significantly larger farm incomes. But I have also shown you that certified and non-certified farms differ in many important ways. And of course, we don't control for these differences looking at descriptive statistics. And once we do, this is just to say that this holds also for individual standards. So when we compare non-certified farms against fair trade certified farms and organic certified farms, that holds for all standards. So all certified farms, irrespective of the standard, have higher farm incomes. But once we control for these various ways in which certified farms differ from non-certified farms, these differences disappear. So I will walk you through this table, which is just a summary of various regression results. So these are regular fixed effects models where we focus on farms. So therefore the sample size is large. Then in the columns 2 to 5, we use pseudo-panel methods. So here we look at average farm income in each cluster, district, province, and department, and that is also why the sample size is reducing. And then there are two different ways we can think about this problem. So the first one is whether any farmer in the cluster, district, province, or department is certified. And the second one is the proportion of farms in each cluster, district, and so on that are certified. So irrespective of the way we define the variables, we don't find any association between certification and average farm income. So maybe to just make that clear again, if we look at column 2 to 5, if at least one farm in the administrative unit is certified, the average farm income does not increase. And then for the percentage, the interpretation would be a change in the proportion of certified farms is not associated with a change in average farm income. And that holds also when we differentiate by standard. I have those large tables if somebody is interested in looking at each individual standard. Otherwise, you can believe me that this holds also when we differentiate by standard. Then when we look at large farms, so this table is just organized the same way as the previous table that I just showed you. And when we look at large farms, there seems to be a bit more indication that certification is actually associated with a change in farm income. And I'm saying that because I think in column 1, we're looking at fixed effects. Again, the number of farms that are observed more than once and that have a change in the certification status is very small, especially for the subsample of large farms. So we don't want to overly rely on the regular fixed effects models. And then for provinces and departments, the sample size also becomes relatively small and probably the measures a bit imprecise. So looking at clusters and districts, which I would say are like the preferred models we want to look at, there seems to be at least an indication that there is an association. These results are entirely driven by global gap. So once we differentiate by standard, there are the results for all standards but global gap are not significant. Any questions so far? Okay, then we move to integrated pest management. So when we look at the descriptive statistics first on the left-hand side, you can see that integrated pest management is not very common, but that certified farms, so around 20% of the certified farms use integrated pest management, and much fewer non-certified farms use those methods. Then when we look at regression results, again, controlling for the various ways in which certified and non-certified farms differ, we don't find any association at all, irrespective of the specification that we use. Which again, holds across standards, so there are no differences by standards. There's no association between integrated pest management and certification. These results are also similar, looking at other farming practices, such as the use of organic fertilizers, chemical pesticides, and so on. Although organic certification is associated with an increased use of organic fertilizers, which we would also expect. But otherwise, there aren't any significant associations. This again looks different when we look at large farms. So again, focusing first on the left-hand side, descriptive statistics suggest that about 90% of the certified farms use integrated pest management, whereas only 40% of the non-certified farms use integrated pest management. And this still holds once we use our regression framework. The proportion of certified farms in each cluster, district, and province is associated with an increase of the proportion of farms that use integrated pest management. So there seems to be an association. Again, these results are entirely driven by global gap and don't hold for any of the other standards. I conduct several robustness checks. I looked at medians in terms instead of means. I include a large set of control variables. Did some other things that you can do. So I also use propensity score matching because somebody was suggesting it. And I also played around with the definition of small and large farms because you can challenge the cutoff 50 hectares. So you can come up with different definitions of large and small. But all of these robustness checks suggest that the results that I've just shown you are relatively robust. I want to point out some limitations. So as I've highlighted throughout the presentation, it's a bit challenging to differentiate by standard because of the small sample sizes, especially for all standards, but large global gap certified farms and small organic certified farms. Also, because of the relatively small sample size of double certified farms, I didn't think it was feasible to look at the effect of double certification. Other standards, although not very important in the Peruvian context, are not specified, so that could in theory also be interesting. Identification is, of course, also something, a problem that we have to keep in mind if there are unobserved time variant factors that matter. Results may still be biased. And in terms of outcome variables, ideally, we would want to have much more information on socioeconomic outcomes, on environmental outcomes. That would be great, but we don't have those data. So unless there are any questions, I will try to put these results a bit into context. Okay, no questions. So in terms of
there was a
income,
question.
Yes. Yes.
I'm still getting used to I haven't used this raised hand feature. Sorry, I forgot who raised their hand.
It looks like
not me. I raised the hand. Songqing.
Okay, let me find them.
Okay, yeah. So, so if I have a question. So I see earlier you mentioned they joined as a group, right? It's not individual certificate. It's a more group certification. So are these small farmers? They are also part of the farm cooperative or some organized groups. So actually I think about your other paper you have done is more like separate these two effects, right? So if they are already in cooperatives, so whether they now join, actually they're not themselves to join, maybe it's a cooperative to join, and they also join, right? Because and that may already benefit from the organizations already, and then this additional value may be limited. A larger farmer, maybe they are more individual operation. So I'm not sure whether this is part of the reason. Yeah.
Yes, so you're absolutely right. So the large farms, we can be relatively sure that they're individually certified. So it's entirely their decision, unlike the buyers convince them to become certified, which is often the case. But well, yes, at the large farm, when you look at large farms, it's an individual decision. And if you look at small farms, it's still an individual decision because farmers are always free to drop out of cooperatives or to leave the certification program if they disagree with the idea. So it is still an individual decision, but you're right that for farmers, it's typically a precondition to be a member of a farmer organization because individual certification is typically not feasible for them. So it's a complex, multi-level decision-making process, I would say, because it's an individual decision from each farm whether to join a cooperative, whether to join a certification program. But then there's also a decision at the cooperative level does that cooperative want to become certified or not? And then it's also a decision that buyers make, or that maybe NGOs make if they choose cooperatives which they want to support. So yes, it's a multi-level decision-making process that is very crucial and that has been largely overlooked in this literature. That is correct. I think that would not necessarily challenge these results because using fixed effects, we control for that, so we are not comparing apples with pears. But yes, it's a very, very important thing to point out. I agree. And unfortunately, this data set doesn't include any information on the cooperatives. That would be, or at least not very much. There's some that I could actually look into that. So there are some questions. What type of services the cooperatives provide? Yes, but this is a farm survey and not a cooperative survey. So it's a bit limited as to how much we can look.
Also, it's external validity. So if you were certify these individual farmers individually, the results may be a little different, right?
I think I didn't get that point. Can you repeat that?
So so my argument is if you have already benefited a lot from cooperatives, whether this certificate give you additional benefit, because if this certificate have some price benefit or some guarantee, but if the cooperative also help you marketing very, very well, see, then you may not get additional benefit out of the certification.
Right.
More about explanation, but not necessarily yeah, okay.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. So I think if this was a cross-sectional data set, we would want to make sure to compare organized non-certified farms against organized certified farms to make sure the control group is reasonably comparable. Although then it's also sometimes the case that NGOs help farmers to build cooperatives and to organize so that they can become certified. So in that regard would be kind of the outcome of certification. But well, maybe that goes a bit too far. I think you have a good point, and I think it relates very much to one of the points that I will also make. Like, you have to think very carefully about control groups, like what type of farms are you actually comparing, especially in the context of small cross-sectional surveys and data sets. Yeah, thank you for that question.
Yeah.
There are more questions? Okay. So for farm income, we find that there seems to be an association.
There was one more in the chat.
Okay.
Sorry. So the question is from Eduardo, and the question is, in general, how do farms get certified? Is it because they are approached by NGOs, the government, other institutions, etc.? And is there any chance you can use this info to figure out when the farms got certified?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So unfortunately for this data set, there's no way I can look into this. But I can talk about the survey that we did in Côte d'Ivoire, because there we did ask cooperatives exactly those questions. And it differs a bit across cooperatives. So sometimes it's buyers who require farmer organizations to become certified, because let's say Mars wants to sell certified chocolate, and then it's a requirement that the buyers impose on farmers. It can be that NGOs approach farmer organizations because development agencies implementing programs that try to promote and facilitate participation. But sometimes it's also just the initiative of the cooperatives themselves, because they feel it's a good marketing opportunity for them, or because they very much support the ideas or the goals of certification. So I think it can vary a bit from cooperative to cooperative what their actual reason is. And for this data set, I have no idea what the reasons were and for how long they have been certified. Are there more questions?
Yes, so there is one more from Titus. So first he wants to thank you for the excellent talk and thank you for being our guest here. And then the question is, since smallholder farming is still prevalent in many developing countries, do you see benefits from small farms?
Oh, that is a very general question. Yeah, I mean, of course, I'm not arguing here that small farms shouldn't be, that we should actively eradicate small farms. I think my point is more that it makes sense to look at large farms because they have been overlooked in this literature. And of course, it makes a lot of sense to support small farms because those are some of the most vulnerable people globally. I don't know if we have to support them because they have a small land size. Maybe there are better ways to target poor people. But yeah, no, my point here is really more that large farms have been overlooked in this literature. And I think that is a mistake because certification is very prevalent among this group of farms.
And then another question from Tom Reardon is, are there farm size ceilings for getting some kinds of certification like fair trade? So can a farm be too big to be able to be certified?
No, not really. I mean, fair trade and also other standard setting organizations have different standards. So fair trade would have standards for farmer organizations. Those are the smallholder farmers that come together and become certified jointly. And then there are individual certificates for large farms like plantations, large farms that rely on hired labor. Those are two different sets of standards that Fairtrade has developed. And they actually have a third one, which is for contract farming. But there is, in general, any type of farm, irrespective of the size, can be certified. I see why you're asking that question because, as I mentioned in the beginning, Fairtrade International and Fairtrade USA split at some point into two organizations because Fairtrade USA didn't think it was a good idea to certify those large farms with hired labor. They were arguing that no, certification, like our goal is to promote small farms. We don't appreciate large farming in general, and that's why they didn't want to certify large farms. But that changed. So now today they both certify large and small farms. That said, for small farms, there's a ceiling on the proportion of farms, of small farms that can be very large. If you go very deep into the fair trade standards, I don't recall that figure, but definitely also in the small farm context, there are some farms that can be larger. So the idea there would be that you don't want to have like smallholder standards for farms that are actually so large that they should be certified as farms that rely on hired labor, because in that case, Fairtrade wants to impose stricter requirements on working conditions. That is, I think, the idea.
And then another question from Francisco. He writes, I know there was an initiative for self-certification in Peru. I think it was because of the high cost of other certifications. And did you have information about this?
Oh, that is interesting. No, I have no idea about that. I would be keen to learn more about that. Didn't hear about it. That's a disadvantage of using secondary data, that you miss those stories. So yeah, please, I would be happy to learn more about that if you have more information. More questions?
Not at the moment.
Okay, good. So then I will go ahead and put these results a bit into context. So the studies suggest that that certification is associated with higher farm incomes among large but not among small farms. At least we have some good indication that that might be the case. Well, why might that be the case? Well, a good hypothesis, or at least a reasonable assumption, would be that this is because of economies of scale. And other studies that have been looking more at export performance also suggest that small farms are negatively affected if very strict standards are imposed on them. So firm size does matter, in at least in other contexts. So that's of course a very reasonable explanation. But then I think in this data set, another explanation is that farm size, or like being small or being large, is associated with the type of standards that farms are certified under. So for large farms, it's mainly global gap. For small farms, it's mainly organic. And at the same time, they also produce different type of crops. So for global gap certified farms, it's mainly fruits and vegetables. And for small farms, some of them produce products where demand is not necessarily increasing. So especially for coffee and cocoa, since participation rates have been increasing so massively, so the production area has been increasing a lot, we might even think that there's some oversupply developing, which of course puts more pressure on farmers and would eventually reduce the benefits that farmers can derive from participation. And other people have made that point quite convincingly. So I think here is the point is that this outcome cannot only be explained with farm size per se, but also with the type of standards and the type of crops that large farms are producing compared with small farms. So it's not just about the farm size. So then in terms of integrated pest management, I also find that that certification is associated with an increased use of integrated pest management, but this does not hold for small farms. And this makes sense also because of a couple of reasons. The first is that integrated pest management is a key requirement of global gap, which of course does not mean that participation rates must be high. So that's an empirical question. And well, this study shows that most of the large farms actually comply with this requirement of global gap to use integrated pest management. And then the second one is that, as I've mentioned before, monitoring can be very difficult in the smallholder context because in theory, you would want to go to each small farm and verify whether they really use integrated pest management or whatever requirement. And that's just infeasible. So certification agencies will typically go to a number of farms and check whether those farms comply. And most of the certification of the auditing would rely a lot on cooperatives. So going through the documents and interviewing people there. So compliance with requirements is just much more difficult in the smallholder context. And as a result, we may not expect that compliance is 100%, irrespective of the specific requirement that we look at. Could also be other requirements. It doesn't have to be integrated pest management. So the key messages of this paper are that certification is more common among large farms than among small farms. That large farms at the same time are possibly more affected by standards than small farms because of the reasons that I just mentioned. So I'm suggesting that the role of certification among large farms has been underappreciated and deserves more attention. Also, what we just discussed, certified farms differ very much from average farms. For example, membership of a cooperative is almost a requirement because otherwise it's just very unfeasible for farmers to become certified. And as I've shown in the previous slides, they also differ in various other ways. So I think this poses some, or that should make us wonder how suitable previous control groups were studies that are based on small case studies using cross-sectional data where you can't control for some of these differences. So this study is the first to use nationally representative data and to differentiate between small and large farms. And I think we need more of that type of analysis, which is of course limited by data availability. So I very much hope that large data sets such as LSMS and others would in the future include more information on issues such as certification, contract farming, or cooperative membership, especially also beyond the general categorization into certified or not, or contract farmer or not. If we could have more information on the features of the certification scheme, on the features of the cooperatives or contract schemes, that would be very valuable. But I'm optimistic in that regard, because I assume that in the coming years we will have much richer data sets that we can work with in the future. And then, well, I do have to point out, because I've been arguing that that I'm improving here on external validity, but of course these results are not necessarily generalizable beyond Peru. And that brings me to my last slide, where just and I'm mentioning this just because it's very related to this paper that I've been just presenting. So I'm also happy for feedback if anyone has ideas on this. So in my ongoing work, I want to go further in increasing external validity. And I just got this great data set from Fairtrade International. After a long negotiation process, they were willing to share data with me. So this data set includes the location of all certified cooperatives and companies. So companies, those are the large farms in Africa, so for the entire continent. And it also includes the year of certification. So when did this farm become certified, this farmer organization, or company, and maybe also when they were excluded from the program. So based on the year and on the location identifier, I can merge those data with secondary data such as LSMS, DHS, or other data sets. And the areas that I want to look at are community level effects and also landscape level environmental effects. So for example, income, wages, other sustainability outcomes, deforestation, change in cropping patterns, or soil erosion. And I think another area could be to look more into the networking effects or the clustering of farms, because as I've been also showing with this data from Peru, certified farms tend to cluster. So what you can also see in this data set from Fairtrade is that that certified farms are very concentrated in certain countries, and they are very concentrated in certain areas of certain countries. So I think kind of the spatial distribution of certification and how it evolves over time could be very interesting here. And again, I'm also looking forward to more comments if somebody has more comments on that. Otherwise, I thank you very much for your attention. I know that many people are already a bit tired of sitting in front of their computer all day long. So I would very, very much appreciate that people are attending.
Eva, thank you so much. That was an extremely interesting presentation, and your ongoing research with that amazing data from Fairtrade sounds super spicy. So I think what we are going to do here, and Jim can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Jim is planning to allow everyone now the option to unmute. And so if they want, they can unmute themselves and ask their questions. As Jim's doing that, we do have another question on the Q&A that I think we can start off. So Francisco asks, could it be possible that the effect of getting a certification that you're measuring could be reflecting the effect of exports? So he says, I think producers oriented to the domestic market don't usually get these certifications, and most of the certified farmers are oriented to exports, at least in Peru.
Yeah, well, I think for many of the crops, there would be produced for export markets in general. So if you produce coffee or cocoa, like a large share of that production would go to the export market either way. And it's difficult to change that quickly, right? Because those are perennial crops. So you cannot just start producing coffee now because you can export it. So I don't think that should necessarily challenge these results. But I think it adds to my point that certified farms and non-certified farms differ in so many regards, because all of these farms that don't produce export products, like they are not likely to become certified.
Excellent, thank you. So, Jim, have you unmuted everybody, or it looks like maybe you're still in the process?
There was one more question in the chat, if we want to get that one first.
You do it, I don't see it.
Okay, yeah, so this is from Eduardo, and he writes, your findings seem to suggest very limited benefits of certification among small farmers. If are any positive self-selection that isn't removed by the fixed effects. So just for example, if the firms decide to get certification at a time when it's most beneficial to them, this would imply that the benefits are even smaller. So the question is,
yes.
Why would any small farms decide to get certification at all?
Yeah, that's a very good comment. So yes, the benefits seem to be very small, non-existent. I think that can be explained on various grounds. I think pressure on smallholders, especially those producing producing coffee and cocoa, where the market is already very concentrated, and now certification is becoming also, like certified products are also becoming a mainstream commodity. So I think in general, in that context, we wouldn't necessarily assume that farmers benefit a lot. So if there's any surplus produced, that would most likely be captured by those large actors that hold a lot of market power, I would say in general. And then why would farmers benefit? I think, and that is what I've been arguing in previous work, that people might sometimes we focus a lot on these economic outcomes, but I think certification also has some more indirect benefits that farmers might appreciate. So access to extension or inputs, or just accessing those markets. So I think there are a couple of benefits that are less direct and might just evolve over time, and sometimes don't have any direct economic benefits at all. So I think that could be one explanation, and a second explanation could be that income variability over time is reduced. That is also something that I was thinking about using this data, whether the income variability of farmers changes is reduced, because there would be a risk reduction strategy, right? If you can have certification as kind of a security that you don't have these huge changes in your income, that might be something that especially risk-averse farmers would appreciate. So yeah, that is on my research agenda. I think that could be a good explanation why farmers would still want to join, even if on average their income is not substantially higher. But I think in general, yes, the benefits are relatively small, and I think I think the available evidence has in many situations overestimated the effect because of the samples that we're using.
Excellent, thank you so much. Does anyone have other questions? It looks like Songqing and Titus are unmuted. Maybe they are hoping to jump on the mic.
No, when I look at the data, descriptive data, look at the percentage of certification, actually I see some quite noticeable drop, right? From 90%, 93%, or to some much smaller percent for small farms. I couldn't remember for the large farm, but I just wonder why you're from 93% to 81%, right? So there's 36% to 21%, both of them.
You mean that the participation rates among large farms vary a lot?
No, actually, both of them drop over time, right?
Ah, okay. Yeah, they do. Although then right. Yeah, you're right. It decreases. Well, not in 2018 for large farms, but you're right. There's a drop in participation rates. at least comparing 2014 and 2018. Yeah, maybe over time there are less farms willing to participate because they don't derive the expected benefit. That could be the case.
Yeah, and also could mean the fixed effect whether you really see in the early round. So you want to have non-participant to participants, right? In the method. So if you already participate, you become less not part. Of course, that could also be disadoption. Yeah, probably just.
I think you have a good point there, which is that maybe it would be useful to differentiate between those farms that become newly certified and then have then look at only those farms that drop out. That is possible with regular fixed effects. I think that would be a great analysis, but that becomes more difficult. That becomes somewhat more difficult in the pseudo panel approach. Yeah, I have to think about that a little bit.
My wish, it looks like you're raising your hand. Do you have a question to ask?
Yeah, it was triggered by what Sonqing said, and I just wanted to make sure I understood correctly. The figures in this table, 0.93 and the last 0.81, I think this is like not 93 and 81%, but it's just 0.93, which is less than 1% in all the years. Is that correct? Or
yes, that is correct. That's correct.
Okay, yeah,
like
so so to me, just less than 1% of small farmers actually certifying shows that they don't see that much benefit, and so they have not, there's a not big rush by small farms to get certified. I mean, it just shows in your empirical data.
Yes, thank you for asking that question. So yes, this is smaller than 1%, but I think we should keep in mind that certification wouldn't be like a feasible option for many farms. If you're like a farmer who produces corn somewhere in an area with no access, then you will not become certified. So certification is very relevant for a handful of crops. So if we look at only those farms that produce coffee and cocoa, the participation rates would be much higher. That said, I think you're right that certification doesn't seem to appear, is definitely not an option for all farms. But then among large farms, participation rates are much higher.
Well, then the follow-up question would be then, if your counterfactual in this case has to be farms that could get certification but are not certified, rather than all the 91 or 99% of farms, small farms that are not certified. So maybe then now it raises a question on what actually is the counterfactual here.
Right. I mean, we use fixed effects here, right? So we are controlling for all of these factors. So our estimates rely on the farms that have a change in certification, or the proportion of farms that are certified in any given unit. But then maybe I can add that even if we do what you might be suggesting, is that we just limit the analysis to those farms that could potentially be certified. You can also do that, of course. I did that also using propensity score matching. It doesn't yield different results because, of course, with the fixed effects model, we remove all of those differences.
Hello.
Yeah, yes.
I think it's more like a comment, because the other participant, she said that less than 1% could be interpreted as not any interest on having a certification. And well, this goes beyond beyond my knowledge, but what I heard from Peru is that so you could have small farmers that they would really like to be certified, but they're small, and so they can't cover the cost of certifications. And you could say, oh, so you could just join a cooperative And as far as I know, there's an institutional problem with these cooperatives that it's just like they're not the rule. Like having a successful cooperative is very hard. So I want to watch these less than 1% like they don't want. Maybe they just can't.
Yes, yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Yes, I think that's true. I think these results tell us that certification is really only a relevant, feasible, or beneficial option for a small number of farms, and those are mainly the farms that produce coffee, cocoa, and other export products, and that are able to join a cooperative, and very often those that receive support. Yes, I think that is what we can. Or at least that is what we know, and that explains why participation rates are relatively small.
Thanks very much. Do we have other questions? All right, well then let's leave it here. Eva, thank you so much for coming on. I think you had a really, really interesting discussion. My wish is saying thanks. Simone also said thank you, and she enjoyed the interesting seminar. Really interesting discussion. I'm so impressed that you were able to kind of speak into an open vacant room for an hour. So great job. We look forward to interacting with you in person someday. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. It has been a very interesting afternoon, evening. I look forward to interacting more. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks all for joining too. Bye.